All right. So today we are going to talk about Titchener. Titchener as one of the primary students of Wundt. He is responsible for bringing a lot of Wundt's ideas to the United States. However, I mentioned to you that his ideas are different. He deviates from Wundt in many ways, but when he translates Wundt's work, it creates more of an impression that they agree on more things than they actually did. So that is a problem. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen now. If I could, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So let me do a couple things. Take this. We're going to I'm sorry, I want to see if I can create additional security. All right, so we're going to hide profile pictures. All right, so we're going to talk about structuralism. Does anyone remember how we conceptualize Wundt's work? Anyone remember how we conceptualize Wundt's work? Anyone? All right. Well, Victoria.
I believe you mentioned it was more qualitative.
Wundt's work? No, Wundt's work is far more quantitative. And he wanted to have a pure experimental version of psychology. Whereas many of the phenomenologists, they wanted more of a subjective version. Now, Wundt's school of thought was referred to as volunteerism. We tend to put Wundt and Titchener into a label called structuralism, but according to Schultz and Schultz, you're going to see that maybe we shouldn't do that. So for the sake of this class, I want you to view Wundt in the terms of volunteerism, right? And we talked about what that meant in the previous class. And what that meant was we are active. We're actively involved in our process of learning and experiencing the world around us. So we make voluntary choices in terms of processing consciousness. I mentioned that his ideas were similar to John Stuart Mill. Now, you may recall James Mill viewed us as passive entities. And all of this is an introduction because you're going to start to see some of those differences. So let's start by saying, hey, well, what did Titchener do? Well, Wundt's version of experimental psychology was brought to the United States by Titchener. And although he claimed that he was representing Wundt's ideas, I mentioned that he altered them. And one of the reasons why he altered them is to smooth out some of the inconsistencies. Today, we would not be too happy about that if someone misrepresented our work. But looking back, this is what we noticed. And the term structuralism, as we're going to define it today, should only be applied to Titchener's work, not Wundt's work. All right. So what was Wundt's version of experimental psychology? He acknowledged the elements of consciousness. So those mental elements that we talk about in terms of the structure of the mind, he acknowledged that. But Wundt put an emphasis on this active organization or synthesis of elements to build up consciousness. Now, that is important, that it is an active process, and it is a process that you are building up. And the reason why that's important is because you're going to see Titchener is going to want to break down consciousness to its smallest parts. Now, the organization of mental elements were voluntary, right? So we actively manipulate our environment mentally. So this is probably more consistent with a constructivist view of the world. So if I were going to say, well, Wundt's version of organization of mental elements, who's it consistent with? It's consistent with Piaget and people like that. Now, Titchener, he did emphasize the elements of consciousness, but he felt the associations were more passive and mechanical. So you already see a divide between Wundt, who felt that that mental process or association happened in a conscious and active process. And Wundt did not agree it was mechanical. Titchener does. So Titchener is going to be more consistent with people like Julien de Lemaitre and people like James Mill, which was the father of John Stuart Mill. Titchener also discards the concept of apperception or building up consciousness. And instead, Titchener wanted to focus on breaking down the conscious experience and trying to understand its smallest parts. And the analysis of one's conscious experience was, in his eye, the most important thing psychology could focus on, or the central task. So who was Titchener? Well, Titchener was a research assistant at Oxford with physiology. He had a philosophy and classics background. Ultimately, he winds up in Germany. He gets a PhD with Wilhelm Wundt, develops a very strong and close relationship with Wundt, and then returns back to Oxford after getting his PhD. And people were pretty skeptical. Now, keep in mind, Oxford is where we talked about the British empiricists, right? Oxford is in England. So the British empiricists wanted to see directly observable data. So his colleagues were very, very skeptical of him and his ideas. Shoot. All right. Now, so what happens? He eventually moves his career to Cornell University. Cornell's in New York State. And that's where he spent most of his career. So between 1893 to 1900, he helped establish laboratories, he collected data, he published. His career shifts in 1900. He starts to become more of a mentor, and he starts to mentor other students' research and help people with their dissertations. And that research, between what he did for himself and what he did with his students, helped develop his ideology, or the system you're hearing about today. Now, I mentioned to you that another thing that Titchener did was he translated Wundt's books, which allowed for there to be more similarity in thought than there really was. Now, Titchener was very, very structured, very formal with his students, clear boundaries. Ultimately dies at the age of 60. Today, we view that as young, considering life expectancy is about 80. But at that time, it wasn't a bad time. It was a decent life to live. Here is a sense of what Titchener's home study looked like. You know, there is this classic view of messiness, right? So you see it with Einstein, you see it with Titchener, you see it with a lot of people that their home studies were quite messy. And that shouldn't shock you, because when your mind is moving in many different directions, it's hard for some people to keep everything in its place. I think there was a quote in the name of Einstein, uh, a clear desk is an empty mind, or something to that effect. And that is the case with many people. Yeah, a lot of knowledge, Jocelyn. You see this with Pavlov as well. Pavlov was also very much in his own head, and we'll learn how disconnected he was from that moment, or the practical, when we get to him. But this was what his home study looked like. He wrote several books, but the most important book he wrote was the Experimental Psychology, a Manual in Laboratory Practice. This was probably one of the most important books in the history of psychology, because it gave guidance to people who followed him how to do experimental psychology. And it inspired other people to feel comfortable developing their own laboratories, right? So you're going to see people like Granville Stanley Hall and many others developing these laboratories, and without a doubt, they benefited from this book, Experimental Psychology, a Manual of Laboratory Practice. It was quite popular. It was well received. It was translated into 5 different languages, so it's pretty popular. Now, aside from the professional lens, Titchener was a person. He had his own interests. He was very much interested in music and coin collecting. So you'll see that he was involved with the music department at Cornell, and as a function of being a coin collector, he learned quite a few languages along the way. So, the Titchener's Experimentalists. This was a group that was established by Titchener. Now, in that day, there was this overt sexism, where there was a belief that women didn't belong in the laboratories, they belonged at home, and there was the male superiority myth, which suggested that males are inherently more intelligent than females. None of this is true, but at that time it was believed. So Wundt had a general rule that women were not allowed for these kind of meetings, and Titchener, with Titchener's Experimentalists, he adhered to this same policy. Now you will see that this is sexist, but Titchener himself was unlikely to be a sexist. He didn't push back enough against the tide in his day. But when we go further, we'll talk about his mentorship with many leading female scholars of the day. But for whatever reason, when it came to the experimentalists, he adhered to Wundt's rule. He felt that, there would be more vulgar talk, people would be smoking, and he didn't want to subject women to that, right? So it's kind of like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she testified in a lot of civil rights cases that related to women. She argued that many of the premises where you were protecting women from this or that, but you were also protecting them from advancement, which was the negative side effect of that. So Titchener his mindset was not uncommon for the day. Now, so when it came to presenting her research to the experimentalists, Christine Ladd Franklin, which you may recall when we talked about in lecture 3, theory of color vision and evolution, she asked him to present her work to this group. Now, Titchener is, with many of the leading scholars, so she wanted her work to be made more available and popularized, and ultimately he declined. So Titchener said no. So in a response, Lad Franklin protested. She rebelled against the system. She suggested that this was extremely old-fashioned and inappropriate. And this tension that she did in person protesting and through the press resulted in Titchener having a lot of anxiety that maybe this whole production would have to be shut down. So that, that's kind of the experimentalists. But I want you to understand that this is only one side of Titchener, where he adhered to some of those old-fashioned views as Lad Franklin suggested. But the other side of Titchener, and this is why I suggest that he probably wasn't a sexist, he just didn't push back enough, was that in a time period where women struggled to get into programs and struggled to get mentors, he was very, very supportive of admitting women into doctoral programs. And more than 1/3 of the doctoral candidates that he worked with, were female. So it's clear that he was trying to promote the advancement of women, but for whatever it's hard to explain why his experimentalists did not include it. And if you were to look at it, this is well beyond any of the contemporary psychologists that he had. In addition to accepting female grad students, helping them get a doctorate, he also hired them. When he was responsible for search committees, he brought many female faculty into academia. So that's another side. Now, who was Titchener's first female grad student? Margaret Floy Washburn. She's first grad student of Titchener. She's also the first female to get a PhD in psychology, which is big, right? She's also the first female to be elected into the National Academy of Sciences. And she became a president of the American Psychological Association. All of this is resume material. So clearly she was groundbreaking and very intelligent. And given the opportunity, she probably would have done even more than she did. But one of her major contributions was the work called Animal Mind, which started to discuss comparative psychology. Now, we're going to talk about the concept of comparative psychology when we get to Darwin, right? And there was an essential understanding that there is a continuity amongst the species. So during evolution, there are striking similarities. And based on that premise, we should be able to study non-human animals and infer properties about humans, right? Because the cognitive process is similar, right? In some cases, the anatomical structure is similar. So when she wrote Animal Mind, it becomes a major piece that, starts us to thinking about the relationship between evolution and comparative psychology. So that is kind of his resume and the duality between, how he led his meetings versus what he was doing at that time period in support of women. Now let's talk about his ideas. Remember when he started doing research and all of this stuff and mentoring students, he started to develop his own philosophies about psychology. And his view was that conscious experience should be the focus of psychology, which he referred to as mentalism. Now, conscious experience if we keep in mind the time period, there's this other developing person, a medical doctor in Vienna by the name of Sigmund Freud, who is starting to talk about the unconscious at this time. So this push to focus on conscious experience is a deviation from what Freud's ideas were, right? Freud believed in studying the unconscious, what's happening beneath the surface. Now, he also felt that psychology was unique relative to the other sciences. Again, you'll see that even from the onset, psychology was viewed as a science, but it was unique. And one of the things that makes psychology unique is that it is dependent on the experience of others. So the experiencing person matters. So it's, by definition, it's more of a subjective science, right? Now, based on this premise, he felt that we shouldn't focus on child psychology because there's not enough awareness and the subjective experience of children may not be mature enough. Animals cannot report their conscious experience. So in that regard, he did not think we should be studying child psychology and animal psychology, all of which in modern psychology we do. So he also warned against this concept called stimulus error, which was describing what you see rather than your experience of it. It's kind of interesting because as you hear the way I'm teaching about Titchener, he sounds a lot like the phenomenologist, truth be told, right? So instead of when you see an apple, you say, I see an apple, that's stimulus error. No, what do you see? I see color. I see redness. I see a deep redness. I see almost like a spherical shape. That is your conscious experience when you label it as an apple versus its redness, its deep redness, its roughly circular shape. You're relying on past information. So that's stimulus error. So you don't want to just label the object because that's based on media experiences or past experience rather than what you're experiencing in the moment, right? So that's pretty cool. Now, in terms of consciousness, he felt consciousness was the totality of our experiences at a given point in time, right? So that involves our sensory experiences and our mentalistic processes, right? So all of the things that are happening at a given time, that's consciousness. And the mind as a whole is the sum of our experiences and all of our learning through time. So structural psychology, which I'm saying is Titchener's version of psychology, was viewed as a pure science, and its purpose was just to understand and discover, this should say facets, right? The aspects of the mind, right? Now, he did not want to understand applied psychology, which it's interesting. He's very, very myopic in what he thinks we should be focused on, right? So apply, trying to solve people's problems or heal people. Clinical psychology, he was not interested in. If it's a pure science, it's a theoretical science that is trying to just understand the aspects or the parts of the mind. So industrial organizational psychology, school psychology, clinical psychology, counseling psychology, forensic psychology, all of these are outside of the purview of study according to Titchener. Now, his ideal candidate, his subjects were only normal adult humans. Now, each of these words mean something. Normal was to the exclusion of people who had mental illness. We can put normal in quotes. Adult was to the exclusion of children. Humans was to the exclusion of non-human animals. Okay, so why? Or why was he so opposed to child, animal, and abnormal psychology? Remember, his goal was, and I'm sorry to be somewhat redundant, his goal was to have a pure science. None of the applications were relevant to this pure science. So we shouldn't speculate at all. And the experience of introspection is either impossible or unreliable in these groups. So introspection in an animal model is impossible. They cannot tell you their conscious experience. When it comes to children and individuals who have a psychological illness, their conscious experience is, their reporting at least of their conscious experience is unreliable. So he was very much, I want to have a clean science that is theoretical, that helps us understand the elements of the mind. So in terms of introspection, right? So what was introspection? He had people explore their mind, their thoughts, their feelings, right? So, and he did that through self-observation, right? So taking stock of one's experience, trained observers, which he likely got from Wundt, teaching people how to be good introspectors, how to be a good and reliable reporter of your experience. And then this is the kicker. He adopted Kolpe's label of systematic experimental observation, which is big because this is a big deviation from Wundt, right? Wundt, he wanted those objective data points. He did not want any subjective experience. He just presented a stimulus and asked you to report. He felt the experimenter should stay as far away from influencing the data as possible. Whereas Kolpe said, no, I'm going to do very probing questions to get more of a qualitative experience of what's going on during introspection. So Titchener is more in line with Kolpe than Wundt in this regard. So Wundt would have never allowed him to do what he did, right? So there is a significant deviation. You know, what popped into my head, which I don't know the answer to, is I wonder what Stumpf would have said. Because remember that big feud between Stumpf and Wundt, to the point where the phenomenologists didn't want to receive his work. They didn't trust his lab. Remember, Stumpf believed that expert musicians were more credible than trained observers. So I'm kind of thinking, well, hey, what would Stumpf say about Titchener? I don't know the answer, because on paper, Titchener looks a lot like Wundt, but as you're hearing me speak today, they're very dissimilar, and he's kind of a hybrid between Wundt and the phenomenologists, if you ask me. So he opposed the idea of objective and quantitative reports. So when I asked you, well, what was Wundt's approach? Remember, I made it, someone said it was more subjective. I said, no, Wundt was very much objective, and he wanted quantitative data. Titchener, in line with the phenomenologists, wanted more subjective and qualitative aspects. Now, in terms of his approach, he wanted to break down consciousness into its parts, into its smallest elements. So it was very much mechanical in that regard. And in this regard, because he believed that your participants are passive and reactive, he was more in line with James Mill. So here's another difference between Wundt and Titchener. Wundt felt that we voluntarily, or make, using volition, we make choices to actively manipulate our mental experience. Titchener didn't think that was the case. So Wundt is more similar to John Stuart Mill, and Titchener is more similar to James Mill in this regard, because of these kind of passive, reactive experiences. So he actually referred to his subjects as reagents, sort of like a chemical reaction, because they're kind of just reacting to the stimulus presented to them. They're not making any voluntary choice. So what was his design? He also was an experimental psychologist, right? So he collected data, and he was a careful researcher in terms of what was observed. But when you take research methods, you'll learn that a single data point is not a consistent one, or cannot be trusted in isolation. So we have this process called replication studies, which is to repeat the process to understand what's going on. And the more consistent that outcome is, the more confident we are in that outcome. Now, Titchener adopted this mindset, suggesting that any outcome or observation you get should be repeated, right? It should be made clear that you should be able to get this consistently. So that's what we refer to as frequent repetition. He also felt that we should have strict isolation. When you're doing an experiment, you have your independent variable, you have your dependent variable, and you want to get rid of any possible confound, right? So strict isolation of whatever he's trying to manipulate or study. So very important. He valued getting rid of confounds, and he intentionally changed the circumstances of the observation to see if the observation could be generalized beyond a particular situation. And the more you could vary the observation or the circumstances, but get similar outcomes, the more you can say that outcome is lawful. So these three elements, repetition, isolation of your variable, and varying the context of the observation, these three elements are perfectly designed for an experiment so that you can have more confidence in your results. All right, so his subjects are reagents. Well, what kind of data did he take, right? So he did an introspection on a whole host of things, and asked people to report back what their experience was, or their sensations were, while doing a whole host of tasks. So you would write down your experience, either in real time or immediately after the experience, and he would get these detailed reports of what you did, and he would find what, so to speak, mental elements, the basic properties of those introspections. Now, he felt that he was doing a very, very meaningful piece of work. He was pretty dedicated, and you'll start to see that he did research on a whole host of things, like sensitivity studies. So he had a stomach tube where people volunteered to put a stomach tube or to be intubated, and he would pour warm liquid in the tube, and it would travel down to the stomach, and then he would pour more cold liquid, and you would report on your experience, what you were feeling at that moment. So that is what we call the organic sensitivity studies. In terms of the sensation of urinating and defecating, he studied that experience. And What isn't talked about is what's called the sex study, where he had people take notes as to their sensory experience while having sex or sexual intercourse. And in some cases, hooking people up to devices to monitor physiological responses, which is interesting because think about when we talk about modern sex therapy and modern sex research, you probably think of people like Masters and Johnson, right? These are, the early sex studies are there, but believe it or not, Titchener was trying to understand physiological responses during sex and your subjective experience of the process, right? So it's interesting. Now, today you might ask the question, was it ethical? It's hard to answer that question. The only thing I will tell you is he was doing this research before there was even the concept of an IRB, the Institutional Review Board. That process comes out as a reaction to World War II and the Nazi experiments. So he was doing it pre-IRB. But imagine you ask one of your graduate assistants, I want you to go home and I want you to seduce your partner, and I want you to do it for the sake of research. I want you to do it. And instead of connecting with your partner as an intimacy process, I want you to pay attention to your experience of the sexual act. If you were to think about that, that comes across as kind of like a boundary cross. It's highly inappropriate, right? You might say unethical, but again, he was doing it at a time where there was no IRB to say it was unethical. Now, what were the three problems of psychology? So he felt that you should be able to reduce a conscious experience into its smallest parts or smallest elements. You should be able to understand the relationship between these elements, and these elements should be lawful, that relationship. And you should be able to connect these mental elements to some physiological process, right? So these were the three problems that psychology focused on. So if I were to say it differently, Titchener is saying these are the three things that psychology should be trying to do, right? So if you're thinking about this, he was really operating as anyone in the natural sciences. And this should not shock you, because the influence of the German physiologists in that day was pretty strong. So trying to connect it to some kind of biological process, trying to establish laws like there are in physics and so forth, he really believed psychology was another natural science in that regard. Now, breaking things down into their smallest parts, understanding how the smallest parts relate, that's fine. But he had no interest in the concept of apperception or building up consciousness or higher level cognitive processes. He just wanted to understand the rudimentary properties of how we experience, right, consciousness. So what are the three elementary states of consciousness according to Titchener? We have our sensations, which are our basic elements related to perception. So if you think of your five senses and what happens in a sense organ, sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell, these were your basic elements of perception. Now, he also felt elements came in other ways too. Elements could come in the form of an image, right? So an image is a reflection on an experience from the past. So things like memory would be a mental element. And then he also, the third piece was affective states, which is emotions, right? So he felt various emotions were mental elements. Now, if you're putting these categories together, these three elementary states of consciousness, and you could find basic elements around them, the list is going to be long, right? So based on categorization, he came up with the belief that there were 44,000 basic or irreducible elements of perception. Now, when we talk about an element, it is at its smallest or most reduced part. But 44,000, think about that number and think about the inspiration from, say, chemistry. When we talk about the periodic table of elements, does it have 44,000 basic elements? No, it has over 100, but 44,000 is very high. So either way, you're going to see the fate of this belief of these mental elements as we progress. Each element was conscious. Each element was distinct from one another. And sensation and perceptions could combine to form ideas through the use of these elements. So when you're studying an element, you could categorize it based on some of its characteristics, right? So things like quality, right? Intensity, duration, clearness, right? So a quality is an aspect of your experience that differentiates it from one another. So if I were to ask you, what is one differentiating factor between a basketball and a football? Now, these aren't elements, but I'm trying to teach you how to distinguish properties or categories. What's the difference or one major difference between a basketball and a football?
The shape.
The shape, right? So the basic answer is the shape. A basketball is round and a football is oblong, right? So that is a big difference. So that's one quality that differentiates them. Intensity, right? Intensity, when we're talking about this is your strength of experience. So if I were turning on a radio and I asked you to describe the sound, intensity would be how loud it was, right? So the amplitude of the sound, right? Duration is the time course, how long it progressed. And then in terms of clearness, this was the role of your conscious attention, actively experiencing it. And attention is the property. If you put more focus on something, it becomes clearer and clearer. So the property of attention is a synonym for clearness. So sensation and images, right, have all four characteristics. And remember what sensations were and remember what images were. Sensation were from the sense organs that you can create a perceptual experience. Image was some kind of experience or memory you had. So these could have all four properties, but emotions or these affective states, he suggested they struggle with clearness, right? It's hard to focus our attention on an emotion because the more we focus on that emotion, its quality changes. He used the word disappears, but I would say changes. So if you are a therapist, and I feel bad saying this because he had no space for therapy, right? So his idea was it's no applied work. But if I had someone come into my office and they're really angry, and then I just reflect back, right? As a clinician, I see you're really angry. A person might say, no, I'm not angry, and then change their whole demeanor because we put attention to that emotion, they changed it. Now, extensity, this has to do with taking up space, things related to the sense of vision and touch have what to do with experiencing space, right? So that makes sense when we think about depth perception and vision, and touch. There, if we're touching something, it has physical properties, right? So it properties of matter. So that makes sense that it would have extensity. Any questions on that so far? Nope. Okay. So in terms of the tridimensional theory of feelings, remember Wundt had this belief that there are three different aspects of affect or emotions or feelings. Titchener says the only one he got right was the concept of pleasure and displeasure. That's it. So there were no three dimensions of feelings. It's just a matter of whether this is an enjoyable emotion, pleasurable emotion, or whether this is a disconcerting emotion, right? Now, by 1918, he dropped the study of mental elements. Remember those 44,000 mental elements he came up with? He came to an understanding that maybe he was wrong. Maybe this isn't the case. So, he dropped the idea of mental elements and said maybe we should study more broadly dimensions of life, which are larger experiences of cognition. So by the early 20s, he even questions whether the concept of structural psychology is the right term, right? So he wanted to change it to existential psychology, which is interesting because we do have an existential psychology, but it is not related to mental elements. It has to do with trying to make meaning or figure out the purpose of existence. So he wanted to change the narrative of what his approach was. Now, he also switched from introspection to this idea of phenomenology. Remember, I said, the way he was leaning, he's leaning more towards the phenomenologist. Well, by the 1920s, he abandoned the idea of trying to break down things into their parts at all, right? So he came to the belief that, you know what, let me just study the mental process or the experience as it occurs. Instead of trying to deconstruct it, I'm just going to study the whole experience. And that to me is cool, because imagine being a leader of your craft and imagine presenting ideas and saying, this is the way it should be. We should be structuralists. We should try and break down consciousness to its elements, and then realizing you're wrong. It takes courage for a scientist to acknowledge that they got it wrong. It takes bravery for a person to say, yeah, maybe I didn't get it right. And that's what he did. So as a scientist, I respect Titchener a whole lot, because we don't believe in mental elements today. The whole approach of structuralism is gone. I said structuralism, the version of psychology that Wundt and Titchener pushed, is gone. Whether we say it's a voluntary or reactive process that we're building up consciousness or breaking down consciousness to its elements, that whole approach is gone. But to be able to say, yeah, I was wrong, that's courage. So, what are some criticisms of structuralism as a whole? So, in terms of the approach of introspection, uh, Immanuel Kant suggested that introspection itself alters experience. And, it's interesting because when Titchener said emotions don't have all these properties, you cannot put all the properties to them, because when you try and pay attention to an emotion, it changes. Immanuel Kant argues even further and says the whole thing, if you do introspection, it alters the experience as a whole, right? Auguste Comte suggested that, the mind can't even observe itself. It can observe all phenomena outside itself, but the idea of reflecting on your experience can't do it. And then Maudsley suggested that, the mind is fraught. It makes a lot of errors. So the whole idea of self-report cannot be trusted. And this is true when you think about it. If I were to ask you to rate yourself on personality characteristics, now obviously introspection was about your conscious experience, but to give you a sense of personality, if I were to ask you to rate your personality in terms of friendliness, even unfriendly people are very likely to rate themselves at least a 5, because there's a self-serving bias. We want to believe that we're at least average, we're at least at the midpoint, even if we're not. So when there are these aspects of the self, we distort reality. So we cannot trust our experience. Okay. Now, in terms of introspection, even if you could do all of these things within a person, it is very hard to get consistency between people, because the way we experience things is subjective to the self. And no two people are going to experience an event the same way. You're not going to experience it identically. So another criticism of introspection is that there's a lacking of reliability, right? So that's big, right? Because if there's no reliability, then the results are not valid. And then the concept of introspection, especially when you think about the sex studies, right? I want you to reflect on what your experience was when you were having sex. Well, that's really retrospection. When you think about it, you're not going to be opening up a notebook and writing in the middle of the act. So you're going to be thinking about it after the fact. And that introspection is not happening in real time. And because it's not happening in real time, it is a retrospective memory. And retrospective memory is flawed, right? So if I were to, I don't know, do an experiment where I said a random sentence and then keep talking, and then 5 minutes later, I say, what was the first thing I said? Most people can't remember even 5 minutes later what was said, let alone as time passes. So this idea of introspection and looking backwards is flawed. All right. Now, that's the concept of introspection, and many criticisms. But other criticisms of structuralism is that it's very stale. It's very artificial. It doesn't have the broad base that we have today. It was very narrow, right? So all of applied psychology is gone. all of comparative psychology is gone. All of child psychology is gone. So it's very narrow as well. So those are the criticisms. What are some of the contributions? Well, he did a good job at defining his variables. So if you're a researcher, he did a good job on operational definitions. So the subject matter that he was studying was very well defined. He also applied the rules of the natural sciences to his study. So from an experimental point, he did a very good job with replications and eliminating confounding variables and making sure this result was consistent across situations. These are really good research method principles. Now, what about introspection? We talked about the process of introspection has some subjectivity, but that doesn't mean, say it again. Someone said something, I missed it. Okay. But it doesn't mean just because introspection has these criticisms, we can't use it at all. When it comes to sensation and perception studies, psychophysicists still use introspection as a data point. Now, so introspection, we're not going to entirely throw out, despite the criticisms I gave you on the previous slide. Last but not least, having a very strong opinion about what psychology should do provides a very, very clear opening for dissension. It allows people to also disagree with you. And we would say that the two biggest contributions that Titchener gave was pushing us towards this experimental research method. Remember his textbook guiding experimental psychologists, so that was great, and providing us a base to argue or disagree. So these are the two biggest contributions. And that is Titchener in a nutshell. So we managed to finish that whole chapter in one lesson, which is, for me, is impressive. So let me stop the recording. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a mini review.